The blood had soaked through the first layer of gauze by minute 2. By minute 4, it had begun dripping onto the plastic armrest of her waiting room chair, slow, steady, ignored. She raised her hand once to get someone's attention. A nurse glanced over, then looked away. A doctor walked past, clipboard in hand, eyes fixed straight ahead like she wasn't even there. By minute 6, a woman across the room whispered to her husband, "Why isn't anyone helping her?" He shushed her and looked down at his phone. By minute 8, the senior physician on duty finally acknowledged her existence. He stood at the intake desk, looked directly at her blood-stained bandage, and said, loud enough for every patient in that lobby to hear, that she would need to wait like everyone else. That her situation did not appear life-threatening. That if she continued to be dramatic, security would be called. She didn't argue. She didn't stand. She just sat there, bleeding in a room full of people trained to stop bleeding, while they watched her do it. What nobody in that hospital knew was that the woman leaking blood onto their waiting room floor owned every machine, every bed, and every badge in that building. And in exactly 10 minutes, she would fire every single person who would let her sit there and bleed. Before we go any further, let me just say, my beautiful family and friends, welcome back. If you're ready for another unforgettable story, do me a quick favor. Hit that like button. Why? Because each like tells YouTube this story is worth sharing with more people who might really need it today. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I read every single one, and honestly, it makes me feel like we're sitting in the same room, sharing these moments heart to heart. Share this video with someone you love. You never know, the story you share might be the encouragement they've been praying for. And if you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story when it drops. This isn't just a channel. It's a family. And when you engage, you're helping us build a safe space where real stories bring real hope. Now, let's begin. Let me take you inside Montgomery Regional Medical Center on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, just past 4 o'clock, when the sunlight was fading behind the glass doors and the fluorescent lights hummed a little too loud. The woman who walked in that day didn't arrive with fanfare. No security. No assistants. No cameras. She came alone, dressed simply, moving slowly, her left arm wrapped tightly in white gauze, a thin streak of red already seeping through the fabric. Her name was Jessica Miller. She was 43 years old. And if you looked at her in that moment, tired eyes, creased brow, breath shallow and uneven, you would never have guessed the truth. Jessica Miller was worth over $1 trillion. She had built her fortune through healthcare innovation, strategic investments, and a personal mission that had driven her for more than 2 decades. She wasn't just wealthy. She was the sole owner of one of the largest private hospital networks in the country. And Montgomery Regional? It was hers. But no one behind that intake desk knew that. What they saw was a black woman in unremarkable clothes, walking in without urgency in her voice, even though urgency lived in her veins. Her pulse was elevated. Her breathing had grown shallow on the drive over. The wound on her arm, a deep laceration from an accident earlier that day, had not stopped bleeding despite pressure. She needed care. Quickly. But when she reached the front desk and quietly explained her situation, the response she received was not concern. It was not efficiency. It was suspicion. The senior physician on the floor, Dr. Howard Crane, 56 years old and 17 years into his tenure, spotted her from across the lobby. He didn't walk over to assess. He didn't check her vitals. He stood near the intake desk, arms crossed, and looked her up and down like she had interrupted his afternoon. His words weren't shouted, but they carried. Every syllable echoed off the clean tile floors and reached the ears of everyone in the waiting room. He questioned whether she truly needed emergency care. He implied she might be exaggerating. He told the attending nurse to flag her file and move on to more pressing patients. A second doctor stood just behind him, Dr. Vanessa Cole, 41, with her arms folded and a thin, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. It was the silence of agreement, of endorsement, of comfort in a system that had never once made her uncomfortable. Jessica didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply nodded, sat down in one of the stiff plastic chairs near the window, and waited. Her arm throbbed. Her pulse climbed. Her jaw tightened, not with anger, but with recognition. Because Jessica Miller had seen this before. Years ago, she had watched her mother sit in a waiting room not so different from this one, tired, in pain, unsure of what was happening inside her body. She had watched nurses shuffle papers instead of checking vitals. She had watched doctors prioritize the louder, lighter-skinned patients who arrived after her mother had already been waiting for over an hour. And by the time anyone took her mother seriously, it was too late. Jessica had made a vow that night. A vow that no one else would die waiting. A vow to build hospitals that didn't just look clean, but felt human. A vow to fight the quiet cruelty of polite indifference. She had built Montgomery Regional from that vow. And now, sitting in her own facility with her own blood seeping through gauze, she was watching the vow be broken, right in front of her. The minute hand on the wall clock ticked forward. Minute 1. Minute 2. No one came. At minute 3, a young intake nurse across the room glanced in Jessica's direction. Her name was Deidre Collins, 27 years old, less than a year into her role. She had noticed the way the senior staff dismissed the woman in the corner. She had seen the blood spreading slowly through the bandage. And something in her gut told her this wasn't right. But she stayed quiet. Because in this hospital, silence was survival. Speaking up was career suicide. At minute 5, Dr. Crane made a joke to one of the nurses near the desk. He didn't look at Jessica. He didn't check on her. He simply laughed, low and casual, as if the waiting room were empty. At minute 7, a man seated across from Jessica pulled out his phone. He wasn't a journalist. He wasn't an activist. He was just a regular patient, waiting for his wife to come out of a routine procedure. But something about what he was witnessing made him uneasy. He didn't know why. But he pressed record. At minute 8, Jessica's hand began to tremble slightly. Her breathing grew more shallow. The pain in her arm had spread into her shoulder, and a faint dizziness was beginning to settle behind her eyes. She looked at the clock. She looked at the staff. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved slowly, not from weakness, but from precision. She dialed a number. Waited. And when the line connected, she spoke only one sentence. Her voice was low, steady, and utterly calm. She asked for an internal medical review to be activated at the Montgomery branch. Immediate. Then she ended the call and placed the phone back in her lap. No explanation. No demands. Just process. Across the room, Dr. Crane didn't notice. Dr. Cole didn't notice. The nurses at the desk didn't notice. They had no idea that in less than 2 minutes, the entire hierarchy of their hospital was about to collapse, and that the woman they had ignored, dismissed, and quietly humiliated was the only reason any of them had jobs at all. The countdown reached minute 10, and then the doors at the end of the hallway swung open. What happened next did not begin with shouting. It did not begin with sirens or announcements. It began with a single pair of footsteps, sharp, rushed, echoing against the tile. And when the senior hospital administrator turned the corner and locked eyes with the woman in the waiting room, everything changed. But before we get to the moment when power shifted and faces fell, we need to understand what was happening in that waiting room. Not just to Jessica, but to the people watching her bleed while no one moved. The waiting room at Montgomery Regional Medical Center was not designed for comfort. It was designed for containment. Rows of stiff plastic chairs bolted to the floor. Fluorescent lights that buzzed just loud enough to crawl under your skin. A television mounted in the corner, playing news no one was watching. And the smell, that particular blend of antiseptic and anxiety that clings to every hospital in America. By minute 3, the room had begun to notice her. Not loudly. Not obviously. But in the way people notice things they wish they hadn't seen. Quick glances, then averted eyes. The uncomfortable shift in a seat. The sudden fascination with a phone screen. Jessica Miller sat near the window, her back straight, her blood-stained arm cradled against her chest. The gauze had soaked through completely now. A thin trail of red had begun to trace its way down her wrist, pooling faintly in the crease of her palm. And still, no one came. Across the room, a young mother held her feverish toddler against her shoulder. She had been waiting for over an hour. Her daughter's temperature had spiked that morning, and her own insurance had already rejected 2 claims this year. She couldn't afford another emergency room bill, but she also couldn't afford to lose her child. So she sat, and waited, and watched the woman by the window bleed. She wanted to say something. She almost did, twice. But the doctors here had already made her feel small once today, questioning whether her daughter's fever was really an emergency. She didn't have the strength to speak up for a stranger when she could barely advocate for her own child. So she stayed silent. A few seats down, an elderly man in a worn corduroy jacket stared at his shoes. His wife was somewhere behind those double doors, undergoing tests he didn't fully understand. The doctors had used words like irregular and monitoring and we'll see. No one had told him what any of it meant. No one had offered him water or updates or even a chair closer to the door. He had seen the woman with the bleeding arm walk in. He had seen the doctor dismiss her. He had seen the nurses look away. And something in his chest, something old and tired and too familiar, recognized what was happening. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and opened the camera. He didn't know why. He didn't know what he would do with the footage. He just knew that someone should be recording this. Someone should remember. He pressed the red button and held the phone low against his thigh, the lens pointed toward the intake desk. By minute 6, the whispers had started. 2 nurses stood near the supply closet, clipboards in hand, voices low. One of them gestured toward Jessica with her pen. The other shook her head slowly, lips pressed thin. They had both seen the blood. They had both seen the woman's pallor shift from exhausted to ghostly. They had both noticed the slight tremor in her hand, the shallow rise and fall of her chest. But neither of them moved. Because intervening meant questioning Dr. Crane. And questioning Dr. Crane meant consequences. Write-ups. Schedule changes. Quiet blacklisting. They had seen it happen before, to nurses who cared too much, who spoke too soon, who forgot that in this hospital, hierarchy mattered more than humanity. So they whispered. And they watched. And they did nothing. At minute 7, Jessica's file was officially deprioritized. A young administrative assistant at the intake desk picked up her paperwork, still incomplete, still flagged as non-critical, and moved it to the bottom of the stack. Not out of malice. Not even out of intention. Just out of habit. Out of routine. Out of the quiet, grinding efficiency of a system designed to sort people into categories and treat them accordingly. Jessica Miller had been satisfactorily categorized. Low urgency. No insurance card presented. No emergency contact listed. No reason to rush. The assistant didn't look up. Didn't notice the blood. Didn't think twice. She simply moved on to the next file. And through it all, Dr. Vanessa Cole stood near the hallway entrance, arms folded, watching. She hadn't spoken a word since Jessica arrived. Hadn't intervened when Dr. Crane dismissed her. Hadn't corrected the nurses or questioned the triage protocol. She had simply observed, with that same faint close-lipped smile she always wore when things were going according to plan. It wasn't a cruel smile. That was the worst part. It was practiced. Professional. The kind of smile you learn to wear when you've decided that certain people's pain is not your responsibility. She watched Jessica grip her arm tighter. She watched the blood drip onto the armrest. She watched the waiting room squirm with collective discomfort. And she smiled. By minute 8, Jessica's vision had begun to blur at the edges. The pain in her arm had deepened, no longer sharp, but thick. Heavy. The kind of pain that spreads into your shoulder, your neck, your chest. The kind of pain that whispers something is very wrong. She closed her eyes for a moment. Steadied her breath. And when she opened them again, she saw the room with perfect clarity. She saw the nurses who wouldn't intervene. The doctors who had already forgotten her. The patients too afraid to speak. The system working exactly as it was designed to, efficiently, quietly, and without mercy. She saw all of it. And she understood. If this story is making you feel something right now, if you're sitting there wishing someone would step in, speak up, do something, then you already understand why this moment matters. That instinct you're feeling? That discomfort? That's not weakness. That's your humanity. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you have done if you were sitting in that waiting room? I want to hear from you. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Because what happens next changes everything. By minute 9, Jessica reached for her phone. Not to call for help. Not to beg. Not to plead. She had done enough waiting. Enough watching. Enough bleeding in a room full of people paid to stop the bleeding. Now it was time for the bleeding to stop. She dialed a number. And when the line connected, she spoke 6 words that would end careers, shatter assumptions, and remind every person in that hospital what accountability looks like when it walks through the door unannounced. Here's something most people don't understand about hospitals. The cruelty is rarely personal. It doesn't need to be. The system does the work for you. Forms get filed. Boxes get checked. Protocols get followed. And somewhere between the intake desk and the examination room, a human being becomes a number, sorted, categorized, and deprioritized without anyone ever having to say the quiet part out loud. That's how it worked at Montgomery Regional Medical Center. And that's exactly how it was working now. Behind the intake desk, a computer screen glowed with Jessica Miller's file. Her information had been entered 12 minutes ago: name, date of birth, presenting complaint. A small red tag sat in the corner of her digital chart, blinking softly. Low priority. No one had examined her wound before assigning that tag. No one had checked her vitals. No one had asked how long she had been bleeding or whether the bleeding had slowed. The tag had been applied automatically, based on a quick visual assessment and a set of assumptions that had nothing to do with medicine. She was calm. She was quiet. She was alone. In the language of emergency triage, that translated to not urgent. The algorithm didn't account for shock. It didn't account for blood loss. It didn't account for the fact that the calmest patients were often the ones closest to collapse, because they had already spent all their energy just trying to stay upright. It only accounted for optics. And optically, Jessica Miller didn't look like someone who needed saving. So the system moved on. But not everyone accepted what the system decided. Deidre Collins stood near the supply station, pretending to organize gauze packets while her eyes kept drifting back to the woman by the window. She was 27 years old, 11 months into her first job as an intake nurse, and already learning that survival in this hospital meant knowing when to look away. But she couldn't look away. Not from this. She had seen Jessica's arm when she first walked in. She had watched the gauze darken from white to pink to crimson in a matter of minutes. She had noticed the way the woman's breathing had changed, shallow, uneven, the kind of breathing that meant the body was starting to compensate for something it couldn't fix on its own. Deidre had been trained to recognize those signs. And everything she saw told her that the woman in that waiting room was not low priority. She was a ticking clock. But when Deidre had tried to mention it earlier, quietly, carefully, to one of the senior nurses, she had been shut down before she finished her sentence. Dr. Crane already assessed her, the nurse had said without looking up. If he says she can wait, she can wait. And that was the end of it. Deidre had thought about pressing further. About walking over to the woman herself. About checking her pulse, her blood pressure, her oxygen levels, anything to confirm what her gut already knew. But she also thought about the last nurse who had questioned Dr. Crane's judgment. A woman named Patrice, 3 years of experience, well-liked by patients and staff. She had flagged a case that Crane had dismissed. She had been right. The patient had been rushed to emergency surgery 2 hours later. Patrice was gone within the month. Reassigned to night shifts, then written up for minor infractions, then quietly let go during a round of restructuring. Everyone knew the real reason. And everyone knew better than to make the same mistake. By minute 10, Jessica's pain had become difficult to hide. She pressed her hand harder against her arm, trying to slow the bleeding through pressure alone. Her jaw tightened. Her breath came in shorter bursts. A faint sheen of sweat had begun to form along her hairline, despite the cold air circulating through the waiting room. She shifted in her seat, not to draw attention, but simply to stay conscious. That small movement was enough. Dr. Crane noticed. He turned from the intake desk and looked directly at her. Not with concern. Not with urgency. With irritation. The kind of look a man gives when something he already dismissed has the audacity to still exist. He didn't walk over to examine her. He didn't ask how she was feeling. He simply called out, just loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, that if she was going to continue being dramatic, she was welcome to leave and find another facility that had time for theatrics. The words landed like a slap. Jessica didn't respond. She didn't have to. The waiting room responded for her, with silence, with discomfort, with a kind of collective shame that fills a space when everyone knows something is wrong and no one does anything about it. And in that silence, Jessica closed her eyes. She wasn't seeing the waiting room anymore. She was seeing another hospital. Another chair. Another woman bleeding while no one came. Her mother. Dolores Miller had been 51 years old when she walked into an emergency room complaining of chest pain and shortness of breath. She had waited for nearly 2 hours before anyone took her seriously. By the time they did, the damage was done. A heart attack, untreated for too long. She died 3 days later in a bed surrounded by machines that had come too late to save her. Jessica had been 23 years old. She had held her mother's hand as the monitors flatlined. And she had made a promise. Not to God, not to the doctors, not to anyone who would listen, but to herself. She had promised to build something better. A hospital system that didn't punish people for being poor. That didn't dismiss pain because it came wrapped in brown skin. That didn't let protocol replace humanity. She had spent 20 years building that system. Funding it. Refining it. Expanding it. And Montgomery Regional Medical Center was supposed to be the crown jewel, the living proof that healthcare could be different. Now she sat in its waiting room, bleeding through gauze, being scolded for daring to exist too visibly. The irony didn't sting. It burned. And in that burning, something inside her shifted. Not anger. Something quieter. Colder. More precise. She opened her eyes. Looked at the clock on the wall. And made a decision. She had seen enough. She had felt enough. She had given them every opportunity to do the right thing. Now she was going to do what she came here to do. What happens next? That's when Jessica makes the call that changes everything. But before she does, there's one more person we need to meet, a young nurse standing at the edge of the room, caught between her conscience and her career. There's a kind of courage that never makes the news. It doesn't look like marching in the streets or standing at a podium or speaking truth to power in front of cameras. It looks like a 27-year-old nurse standing at the edge of a waiting room, hands trembling slightly, weighing her conscience against her paycheck. It looks like choosing to stay when everything in the system is telling you to walk away. Deidre Collins was about to make that choice. She had tried to forget about the woman by the window. She had tried to focus on her tasks, restocking supplies, updating charts, answering the phone when it rang. She had tried to remind herself that she was 11 months into this job, that she had student loans that wouldn't pay themselves, that she couldn't afford to be the next Patrice. But every time she looked up, her eyes found Jessica Miller. And every time she looked, the woman seemed worse. The color had drained from her face almost entirely now. Her breathing had become shallow and irregular, the kind of pattern Deidre had been trained to recognize as early-stage shock. Her hand, still pressed against the blood-stained gauze, had begun to tremble in a way that suggested her body was starting to lose the fight it was waging against itself. Deidre had seen patients like this before. She knew what happened when intervention came too late. She couldn't just stand there. She moved casually at first, grabbing a blood pressure cuff from the supply cart, tucking a pulse oximeter into her pocket. She didn't announce what she was doing. She didn't ask for permission. She simply walked across the waiting room, knelt beside the woman's chair, and spoke softly. She told her she just wanted to check a few things. That it would only take a moment. Jessica looked at her with tired eyes. Eyes that had seen too much in the past 20 minutes. Eyes that recognized what Deidre was risking by coming over. But she didn't refuse. She extended her uninjured arm and let the young nurse work. The numbers told a story. Blood pressure, dangerously low. Pulse, elevated and thready. Oxygen saturation, dropping below acceptable levels. Deidre felt her stomach tighten. This wasn't a woman who could wait. This was a woman whose body was beginning to shut down, quietly, politely, in a plastic chair by the window while doctors joked at the intake desk. She had to say something. She had to tell someone. She stood quickly, tucking her equipment away, and walked toward the intake station. Her heart was pounding. Her palms were damp. Every step felt heavier than the last. Dr. Crane was still there, reviewing something on a tablet, his back half turned to the waiting room. Deidre approached carefully, keeping her voice low and professional. She told him she had checked on the woman in the corner, that her vitals were concerning, that she believed the patient needed immediate evaluation. Dr. Crane didn't look up. He asked flatly whether anyone had assigned her to that patient, whether she had been instructed to perform an assessment, whether she understood what the word triage meant. Deidre tried again. She explained that the blood pressure was low, that the pulse ox was dropping, that the woman's condition had clearly deteriorated since arrival. This time, Dr. Crane did look up, but not with concern, with annoyance. He told her the patient had already been assessed, that her condition had been labeled non-critical by someone with significantly more experience than a first-year intake nurse, and that if Deidre wanted to keep her position at this hospital, she would learn to trust the judgment of her superiors rather than chasing problems that didn't exist. Then he turned back to his tablet. Dismissed. Just like that. But Deidre didn't leave. She stood there for a moment, frozen between instinct and instruction, caught in the space where every young professional eventually finds themselves, the place where doing the right thing and keeping your job become two different paths. And that's when Dr. Vanessa Cole appeared beside her. She hadn't heard the woman approach. But suddenly there she was, arms folded, smile intact, voice low and almost amused. Dr. Cole told her calmly that she had noticed Deidre's little assessment. That it was sweet, really. Admirable, even. But that there was a reason hierarchy existed in hospitals. That the system only worked when people stayed in their lanes. And that nurses who forgot their place, no matter how well-intentioned, tended to find themselves reassigned to less desirable positions very quickly. She said it with a smile. She said it like advice. But Deidre heard it for what it was. A warning. Deidre nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't push back. But she also didn't leave the room. Instead, she walked back toward the supply station, slowly, deliberately, and positioned herself near the wall where she could still see the woman in the corner. She busied herself with a clipboard she didn't need. She straightened supplies that were already straight. And she stayed. Because sometimes courage isn't loud. Sometimes it's just refusing to leave when everyone expects you to walk away. Jessica noticed. From across the room, through the haze of pain and exhaustion, she had watched the young nurse approach Dr. Crane. She had watched the conversation. She had seen the dismissal, the warning, the quiet retreat. And she had seen the nurse stay. Not intervene. Not fight. Just stay. Close enough to matter. Close enough to witness. Close enough to help if the moment came. It wasn't much. In a hospital full of people looking away, it was the smallest possible act of resistance. But Jessica saw it. And she understood what it cost. When Deidre glanced over, their eyes met for just a moment. Jessica gave her a small nod. Barely visible. But unmistakable. A nod that said, "I see you. I know what you just did. And I won't forget. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever been in Deidre's position? Standing at the edge of a moment, knowing what was right but terrified of what it might cost you? Drop a comment below. Tell me your story. Because I believe the people who stay, who refuse to look away even when it's easier, are the ones who change the world. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Because the call Jessica is about to make will change everything. That phone call, and the 6 words that ended careers, is coming next. Some revolutions begin with gunfire. Others begin with speeches. Crowds gathering. Fists raised. Voices crying out for justice loud enough to shake the foundations of power. But the most dangerous revolutions? They begin in silence. With a single phone call. A few quiet words. And the patience of someone who knows exactly what's coming, even when no one else in the room has the faintest idea. Jessica Miller's hand moved toward her pocket. The motion was slow, deliberate, unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world, even though her body was telling her she didn't. Even though her pulse was weakening and her vision was beginning to blur at the edges and the gauze around her arm had long since stopped being white. She pulled out her phone. A simple device. No flashy case. No visible logos. Just a dark screen that lit up at her touch. Across the room, Dr. Howard Crane noticed the movement. He watched her for a moment, the way a man watches something insignificant, something beneath his concern, and then turned to the nurse beside him with a knowing look. He assumed she was calling for backup. A family member. A friend. Someone who would arrive in 20 minutes, cause a scene, and eventually be handled with the same polite dismissiveness that had worked on hundreds of patients before. He whispered something to the nurse. She covered her mouth to hide a smile. They weren't worried. They should have been. Jessica didn't scroll through her contacts. She didn't search for a name. She pressed a single button, a number saved to her favorites, known only to 7 people in her entire organization. The phone rang once. A voice answered on the other end. Professional. Alert. Ready. Jessica spoke. Her voice was low. Steady. Completely devoid of emotion. 6 words. Activate internal medical review. Montgomery branch. She didn't elaborate. She didn't explain who she was or what had happened. She didn't describe the blood on her arm or the doctors who had mocked her or the nurses who had looked away. She simply delivered the instruction, calm, precise, surgical, and waited for confirmation. The voice on the other end responded with 2 words. Understood. Activating. Jessica ended the call. She placed the phone back in her lap, folded her hands over it, and closed her eyes. The waiting room continued as if nothing had happened. Phones buzzed. Children whimpered. The television in the corner played a commercial for car insurance that no one was watching. A man near the entrance coughed into his elbow. A woman flipped through a magazine she wasn't reading. At the intake desk, Dr. Crane returned to his tablet. Dr. Cole remained stationed near the hallway, arms folded, expression unchanged. The nurses moved through their routines with the mechanical efficiency of people who had long since stopped seeing patients as people. No one noticed the call. No one understood what had just been set in motion. To everyone in that room, Jessica Miller was still just a woman in a plastic chair, bleeding, waiting, irrelevant. But 43 miles away, a system was waking up. In a high-rise office overlooking the city, a secure server received a coded alert. The alert triggered an automated notification to the regional compliance director. The compliance director received the message, read it twice, and immediately forwarded it to the hospital network's chief operating officer. The COO was in a meeting when her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. Her face changed. She excused herself without explanation, walked into the hallway, and made 3 phone calls in rapid succession. The first was to the head of hospital security. The second was to the legal department. The third was to Sandra Whitmore, the regional administrator assigned to Montgomery Regional Medical Center. Sandra answered on the first ring. She listened for 11 seconds. Then she grabbed her coat, told her assistant to cancel everything, and sprinted toward the elevator. Back in the waiting room, the clock continued its slow march forward. Minute 8. Minute 9. Jessica's breathing had grown shallow. Her grip on her phone had loosened. The tremor in her hand had become more pronounced. But her expression remained calm, almost peaceful, because she knew what was coming. She had built this system herself. Every protocol, every safeguard, every chain of command designed to ensure that when accountability was needed, it arrived swiftly and without warning. She had never imagined she would be the one to trigger it. She had never imagined she would be sitting in one of her own hospitals, bleeding through bandages, waiting to see if anyone would treat her like a human being. But here she was. And now the clock was running out, not for her, but for the people who had decided she wasn't worth saving. At the intake desk, Dr. Crane checked his watch. He muttered something about shift changes and weekend plans. Dr. Cole laughed at something a passing nurse whispered to her. The administrative assistant continued processing files, moving Jessica's paperwork further and further toward the bottom of the stack. They were comfortable, confident, untouchable. They had handled patients like this before. They would handle her too. What they didn't realize was that 27 miles away, a black sedan had just merged onto the highway, exceeding the speed limit by 15 miles per hour. Inside, Sandra Whitmore gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, her mind racing through every possible scenario that could have triggered an internal medical review at her hospital. She didn't know the details yet. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty: someone with enormous power had just pulled the trigger. And heads were about to roll. The minute hand on the waiting room clock clicked forward one final time. Minute 10. Jessica opened her eyes. She looked at the intake desk. At the doctors who had dismissed her. At the nurses who had stayed silent. At the system that had failed exactly the way systems fail when no one is watching. And she waited. Not much longer now. If you're still here, if this story has its grip on you and you need to know what happens next, then hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications. Because when that door opens and the truth walks in, you're going to want to see every single face in that room. We're about to find out what happens when power meets accountability. And trust me, It's worth the wait. Somewhere in the distance, tires screeched into a parking lot. A car door opened, and footsteps began echoing down the corridor, fast, urgent, unstoppable. The doors at the end of the hallway didn't swing open. They flew. Sandra Whitmore burst through them like a woman escaping a fire, except the fire wasn't behind her. It was ahead. Waiting. Sitting in a plastic chair by the window with blood-soaked gauze wrapped around her arm. Sandra was 54 years old. She had spent 31 years in healthcare administration. She had survived budget cuts, hostile board meetings, malpractice suits, and 3 complete leadership overhauls. She had seen crises that would have broken lesser professionals. But nothing had prepared her for what she was about to walk into. Her heels clicked against the tile floor in rapid staccato. Her breath came in short, controlled bursts. Her eyes swept the waiting room with the desperate efficiency of someone searching for a bomb. Patients looked up, startled by the sudden commotion. Nurses paused mid-task, clipboards frozen in their hands. Even the television in the corner seemed to go quieter, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Sandra's gaze moved across the space, past the elderly man with the phone still recording, past the young mother clutching her feverish child, past the intake desk where Dr. Crane stood with his tablet in hand. And then her eyes found the woman by the window. Time stopped. Not metaphorically. Not poetically. It literally stopped. Sandra Whitmore, a woman who had built her entire career on composure, on control, on never letting anyone see her sweat, froze in the middle of the waiting room like she had been turned to stone. Her face went white. Not pale. White. The kind of white that happens when blood drains from the head so fast the body forgets how to compensate. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. And when she finally spoke, her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Ms. Miller. 2 words. That's all it took. 2 words, spoken quietly, almost reverently, and the entire room shifted on its axis. At the intake desk, Dr. Howard Crane's hand stopped mid-gesture. His tablet slipped slightly in his grip. His eyebrows, which had been raised in casual amusement just seconds before, slowly descended into something else entirely. Confusion. Then recognition. Then horror. Dr. Vanessa Cole's smile, that practiced, polished, untouchable smile she had worn all afternoon, cracked. Literally cracked. The corners of her mouth trembled. Her arms, still folded across her chest, tightened involuntarily, as if she were trying to hold herself together. The nurses at the supply station exchanged glances. One of them whispered something. Another shook her head slowly, the color draining from her cheeks. And across the room, Deidre Collins, the junior nurse who had stayed when everyone else looked away, felt her heart stop. Because she understood now. She understood everything. The waiting room had gone completely silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that has weight. The kind that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. The kind that fills a space so completely, you can hear your own heartbeat echoing in your ears. No one moved. No one spoke. Every eye in the room was fixed on the woman in the plastic chair, the woman they had ignored, dismissed, mocked, and left to bleed for the past 10 minutes. Jessica Miller. The name began to ripple through the room in whispered fragments. Someone near the entrance pulled out their phone and started searching. Someone else gasped audibly. A child asked their mother why everyone looked so scared. Because they did look scared. All of them. The doctors who had laughed. The nurses who had stayed silent. The administrators who had followed protocol instead of instinct. Every single person who had participated in, or allowed, what had happened in this waiting room. They all looked absolutely terrified. Sandra Whitmore approached Jessica slowly. Carefully. The way you approach something fragile. Something explosive. Something that could end your entire career with a single word. She knelt beside the chair, ignoring the blood on the armrest, ignoring the stares of everyone around her. Her voice trembled when she spoke again. She asked if Jessica was all right. She asked what had happened. She asked why no one had helped her, why she was sitting here bleeding when she should have been in an examination room the moment she walked through the door. Jessica didn't answer. Not yet. She simply looked at Sandra with eyes that held no anger, no rage, no visible desire for vengeance. Just clarity. The kind of clarity that comes from seeing exactly what you needed to see. Behind them, Dr. Crane had begun to back away from the intake desk. His face had shifted from horror to calculation, the look of a man trying to figure out how to escape a situation he had never imagined himself in. Dr. Cole had unfolded her arms. Her hands hung limply at her sides. Her smile was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like nausea. The nurses whispered frantically among themselves. One of them was already crying. And in the corner, the elderly man with the phone lowered his device and stared. He didn't need to record anymore. What was happening now would be burned into the memory of everyone present for the rest of their lives. Jessica Miller rose from her chair. Slowly, painfully, with the kind of deliberate grace that only comes from years of carrying weight that would crush lesser people. Sandra reached out to steady her, but Jessica raised a hand gently, not in refusal, but in reassurance. She was steady enough. She had been steady this whole time. And now, for the first time since she walked through those doors, she was ready to speak. We're about to enter the moment everything collapses. The hierarchy. The excuses. The carefully constructed illusions of authority that let these people believe they were untouchable. If you've ever waited too long for someone to do the right thing, if you've ever wished you could see the look on someone's face when accountability finally arrives, you're going to want to see what happens next. The waiting room held its breath. And Jessica Miller opened her mouth to speak. There's a difference between power and authority. Power is loud. Power announces itself. Power needs an audience, needs recognition, needs the room to know who's in charge. Authority doesn't need any of that. Authority walks in quietly. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't threaten. It simply acts, and the world rearranges itself accordingly. What happened next at Montgomery Regional Medical Center was not an explosion. It was a correction. Sandra Whitmore straightened her posture and turned toward the intake desk. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud. It didn't need to be. Every word cut through the silence like a blade through silk. She announced that the current triage assessment for this patient was being overridden effective immediately. She declared that emergency protocols were now in effect. She instructed all senior medical staff to step back from the intake area until further notice. Dr. Howard Crane opened his mouth to respond, to explain, to defend himself. Sandra didn't let him. She repeated the instruction, slowly, clearly, with the kind of measured calm that left no room for interpretation. Step back. Now. Dr. Crane stepped back. So did Dr. Cole. So did the nurses at the supply station. So did everyone within 10 feet of the intake desk. They moved like people waking from a dream they hadn't realized they were in, confused, disoriented, suddenly aware that the ground beneath their feet was no longer solid. Within seconds, the room transformed. A gurney appeared from somewhere down the hallway, pushed by two nurses who hadn't been part of the earlier dismissal. They moved with urgent efficiency, their faces professional, but their eyes wide with something that looked a lot like fear. Sandra guided Jessica toward the gurney, her hand hovering near the trillionaire's elbow without quite touching her. Jessica moved slowly, her body finally betraying the exhaustion she had been fighting for the past 15 minutes. But she didn't collapse. She didn't cry. She didn't allow herself the luxury of release. Not yet. There was still work to be done. As they prepared to wheel her toward the examination room, a nurse approached with a small tray, for supplies, medication, the standard preparation for a patient in her condition. She explained, gently, that they were going to administer a mild sedative, that it would help with the pain, that it would allow her to rest while they treated her wound. Jessica shook her head. Not yet. The nurse hesitated, glancing at Sandra for guidance. Sandra simply nodded, not in agreement with the refusal, but in acceptance of it. This was not a patient who could be overruled. Jessica's voice was quiet but firm. She stated that before anything else happened, she wanted to see clarity. She wanted to see exactly how this was being handled. She wanted to witness, fully conscious, fully present, the consequences of what had occurred in this waiting room. Then, and only then, would she allow them to treat her. Sandra understood. She pulled out her phone and made a single call. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. When she ended it, her expression had hardened into something almost unreadable. She turned toward the intake desk, toward the cluster of staff members who had been watching the scene unfold with varying degrees of panic. And then she began. The first badge deactivated at 5:02 p.m. It belonged to Dr. Howard Crane. There was no announcement. No dramatic confrontation. Sandra simply walked toward him, extended her hand, and requested his hospital identification badge and access card. Dr. Crane stared at her. His mouth moved, but no words came out. Sandra repeated the request. Her voice never rose above conversational volume. Her expression never shifted from professional neutrality. Slowly, reluctantly, Dr. Crane removed his badge and placed it in her palm. Sandra handed it to a security officer who had appeared silently from the corridor. The officer scanned the badge once. A soft beep echoed through the room. Access revoked. Dr. Crane's computer session logged out automatically. His name disappeared from the active physician roster. 17 years of tenure, erased in less than 10 seconds. He was escorted toward the exit without handcuffs, without shouting, without any of the drama that television teaches us to expect. Just a man walking beside a security officer, carrying nothing but the weight of his own choices. The second badge belonged to Dr. Vanessa Cole. She didn't resist. She didn't argue. She simply handed it over with trembling fingers and a face that had gone completely blank, the look of someone whose brain had stopped processing reality. Her access was revoked the same way. Her screen logged out. Her name vanished from the system. She was escorted out through a side door, away from the waiting room, away from the patients who had watched her smile while a woman bled. 2 more badges followed. Senior nurses who had been present during the dismissal. Staff members who had participated in the delay. Each termination was handled identically, quietly, professionally, without a single raised voice or theatrical gesture. This was not revenge. This was process. The same process Jessica had built into every hospital in her network, designed specifically for moments like this. Designed to ensure that when accountability was needed, it arrived swiftly, cleanly, and without escape. She had never imagined she would be the one to trigger it. But here she was, watching from a gurney as the people who had dismissed her pain walked past her in silence, stripped of their authority, their careers ending not with a bang but with a quiet beep of a deactivated badge. The waiting room remained frozen throughout the entire process. Patients watched in stunned silence. The elderly man with the phone had stopped recording. There was no need anymore. The young mother held her daughter tighter, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. And Deidre Collins, the junior nurse who had refused to look away, stood near the wall with her hand pressed over her mouth, watching everything unfold. She had stayed. She had risked her job. She had tried. And now she was witnessing what happened when someone with real power saw you. When the courage you thought was invisible turned out to be the most visible thing in the room. We're almost at the end now. But before Jessica receives the care she desperately needs, there's one more thing she has to do. One question she has to ask. A question that will echo through the halls of this hospital, and in the minds of everyone who hears this story, for years to come. If this story has moved you, hit that like button. Drop a comment. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Jessica looked at the faces around her, the ones still remaining, and she prepared to ask the only question that truly mattered. Some questions don't require answers. They require silence. They require the room to sit with what's been asked. They require every person present to look inward, past the excuses, past the justifications, past the comfortable lies we tell ourselves, and confront something they'd rather not see. Jessica Miller was about to ask one of those questions. The waiting room had grown still in a way that felt almost sacred. The terminated staff had been escorted out. The security officers had returned to their posts. The nurses who remained stood frozen near the intake desk, afraid to move, afraid to speak, afraid to do anything that might draw attention to themselves. Sandra Whitmore stood beside Jessica's gurney, her phone clutched in her hand, awaiting instructions. The regional administrator had handled dozens of crises in her career, but she had never experienced anything like this, and it showed in the slight tremor of her fingers, the tightness around her eyes. Jessica looked around the room slowly. Her gaze moved from face to face, the patients who had watched her bleed, the staff who had chosen silence, the young mother still holding her feverish daughter, the elderly man who had recorded everything on his phone. She took a breath, then another, and then she spoke. Her voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but in the silence of that waiting room, it carried to every corner. She asked a simple question. If she wasn't who she was, if she had walked in without a name, without wealth, without the power to make a single phone call and change everything, how long would they have let her wait? That was it. No accusations. No demands. No lengthy speech about justice or accountability or the failures of the healthcare system. Just one question. And it hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore, impossible to answer, impossible to escape. No one spoke. The nurses at the intake desk stared at the floor. The remaining physicians, the ones who hadn't been directly involved but had witnessed everything, looked away. Sandra Whitmore closed her eyes briefly, as if the weight of the question was physically painful. Even the patients in the waiting room, people who had done nothing wrong, who had simply been waiting for their own care, felt the weight of it pressing down on them. Because they knew the answer. Everyone in that room knew the answer. If Jessica Miller had been anyone else, any ordinary black woman walking into this hospital with blood on her arm and fear in her eyes, she would have waited. And waited. And waited. Maybe for an hour. Maybe for 2. Maybe until her condition became so critical that ignoring her was no longer an option. Or maybe, like Jessica's mother, all those years ago, she would have waited until it was too late. The question didn't need an answer. The silence was the answer. Jessica let the moment stretch. She didn't fill it with words. She didn't soften it with reassurances. She let every person in that room sit with what they had witnessed, and what they had allowed. Then slowly, she turned her head toward the wall where Deidre Collins stood. The young nurse hadn't moved since the terminations began. She stood with her back pressed against the supply station, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, her hands still trembling from the weight of everything she had seen. Jessica studied her for a long moment. Then she spoke again. She said that there was one person in this hospital who had tried to help. One person who had checked her vitals when no one asked her to. One person who had approached the doctors, raised concerns, and refused to walk away even when she was dismissed. She asked Sandra to note the name Deidre Collins for immediate promotion to lead intake coordinator. Deidre's knees nearly buckled. She stared at Jessica, this woman she had never met before today, this woman whose name she hadn't known until 20 minutes ago, and felt something crack open inside her chest. She had stayed because it was right. Not because she expected recognition. Not because she thought anyone would notice. She had stayed because walking away would have meant becoming the kind of person she had promised herself she would never be. And now the most powerful woman in the building was looking at her like she mattered. Like her choice had mattered. Like the small quiet act of refusing to look away had been the most important thing that happened in this waiting room. Sandra nodded, already making a note on her phone. The promotion would be processed within the hour. Deidre covered her mouth with her hand and sobbed, not from sadness, but from something she couldn't name. Relief, maybe. Validation. The overwhelming feeling of being seen when you had expected to be invisible. Jessica wasn't finished. She turned back to Sandra and spoke with quiet authority. She announced that effective immediately, Montgomery Regional would implement a comprehensive review of all triage protocols. Every patient who had been waiting in this room today would be evaluated within the next 30 minutes. No exceptions. No delays. No assessments based on appearance or assumption. She stated that new training would be mandatory for all staff, training focused on implicit bias, on recognizing the difference between protocol and prejudice, on understanding that the way a patient looks should never determine the quality of care they receive. And she made one final declaration. Any staff member who had witnessed what happened today and failed to intervene would be required to complete additional ethics review before returning to patient-facing duties. These were not suggestions. They were instructions. Sandra recorded each one without question. The waiting room began to move again. Nurses approached patients who had been waiting for hours. The young mother was finally escorted to a treatment room for her daughter. The elderly man was offered an update on his wife's condition. One by one, the people who had been sitting in those plastic chairs, forgotten, overlooked, deprioritized, were finally seen. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't celebratory. It was simply right. The way it should have been all along. And through it all, Jessica Miller watched from her gurney. Not with satisfaction. Not with triumph. With something quieter. Exhaustion, maybe. Relief. The bone-deep weariness of a woman who had spent 20 years building a system designed to prevent exactly what had happened to her today, only to discover that systems are only as good as the people who run them. She had done what she came to do. She had seen the truth. She had demanded accountability. Now, finally, she could allow herself to be a patient. The gurney wheels turned with a soft, rhythmic sound, barely audible over the renewed activity of the emergency room. As the medical team prepared to move Jessica Miller toward the treatment area, something shifted in the atmosphere of Montgomery Regional Medical Center. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It was like watching a room remember how to breathe after holding its breath for far too long. The nurses who remained moved with renewed purpose, but also with something else, a careful awareness of every gesture, every glance, every word. They had witnessed what happens when routine becomes cruelty, when protocol becomes prejudice, when the simple act of not caring becomes an institutional failure. Now they moved through the space differently, as if seeing it for the first time. As Jessica's gurney rolled past the waiting room chairs, she turned her head slightly, making eye contact with the patients who had watched everything unfold. The elderly man with his phone, he nodded once, a gesture of solidarity from someone who understood what it meant to be ignored. The young mother, whose daughter was finally being examined in a nearby room, mouthed two words, "Thank you." Not because Jessica had done anything for her directly, but because what had happened in this room would ripple outward, touching every patient who walked through these doors from this moment forward. The blood on Jessica's arm had finally stopped spreading through the gauze. A nurse, one of the ones who had arrived after the terminations, had applied proper pressure and begun preparing in 4-line. Her movements were gentle but efficient, professional but somehow more human than what had come before. She checked Jessica's vitals every 30 seconds, announced each reading clearly, and made eye contact when she spoke. Small things. Basic things. The things that should have happened the moment Jessica walked through the door. If you're sitting there thinking this feels anticlimactic, that there should be more drama, more confrontation, more victory, then you understand something important about how real change happens. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. It arrives quietly, in the space between what was and what will be. The treatment room they wheeled her into was sterile white, equipped with everything needed to properly address her injury. The attending physician, a woman who had been called in specifically for this case, examined the wound with careful precision. Deep laceration, significant blood loss, early signs of shock that could have progressed to something far worse if left untreated much longer. The kind of injury that, with proper immediate care, would heal completely. The kind that, ignored for another hour, might have led to permanent damage, or worse. As they cleaned and sutured the wound, Jessica finally allowed herself to close her eyes. Not from the sedative they had offered. She had refused that, wanting to remain conscious for what came next, but from the simple exhaustion of having carried this moment for so long. 20 years of building hospitals. 20 years of trying to fix a system that had failed her mother. And today, she had discovered that systems don't fix themselves. They require constant vigilance, constant correction, constant reminders of what they're supposed to be. Outside the treatment room, Sandra Whitmore had assembled what remained of the senior staff. Her voice carried through the door, not raised, not angry, just firm. She outlined the immediate changes that would take effect before the hospital opened for business tomorrow morning. New intake protocols. Mandatory bias training scheduled for the entire staff within 72 hours. A complete review of every patient file from the past 6 months, looking for patterns of delayed or dismissed care. And most importantly, the installation of a new oversight system, one that would flag any patient who waited longer than medically advisable, regardless of their appearance, their insurance status, or their perceived priority. These weren't revolutionary changes. They weren't innovative or groundbreaking. They were simply the basic standards of care that should have existed all along. The fact that they required a crisis to implement, that they required a trillionaire to bleed in the waiting room before anyone thought to question the system, said everything about why Jessica had needed to be here today. Down the hallway, Deidre Collins sat in the break room, still processing what had happened. The promotion Sandra had promised would be official within the hour, but that wasn't what occupied her thoughts. She kept thinking about the moment she had approached Jessica with the blood pressure cuff. That small act of defiance. That tiny rebellion against a system that had taught her to look away. She hadn't known who Jessica was. She had simply seen someone who needed help and decided that was enough. Drop a comment if you've ever been in Deidre's position, caught between doing what's right and doing what's expected. Because her story reminds us that sometimes the smallest acts of courage create the biggest changes. As the sutures were completed and the wound properly dressed, Jessica opened her eyes and looked at the physician treating her. The woman was focused, professional, doing exactly what she should have been doing all along. There was no apology in her manner. Jessica hadn't asked for one. There was simply competent, compassionate care. The baseline. The minimum. The thing that every patient deserved, but not every patient received. When they finally wheeled her back through the emergency room toward a recovery area, the waiting room had transformed. Every chair was occupied by a patient actively being assessed. Nurses moved between them with purpose. Clipboards were being filled out. Vitals were being taken. The television still played in the corner, but no one was watching it anymore. They were too busy doing what they should have been doing all along, caring for people who needed care. Jessica caught Sandra's eye as she passed. The administrator looked exhausted, overwhelmed, but also somehow lighter, as if a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had finally been lifted. She had witnessed the collapse of the system she managed and its quiet rebuilding in the span of an hour. Tomorrow, she would face questions from the board, from the media, from investigators. But today, for the first time in her career, she had seen what accountability actually looked like. As Jessica was settled into a recovery room, she spoke her final words of the day, not to Sandra, not to the staff, but to everyone and no one at all. She said that healthcare doesn't fail loudly. It doesn't announce its cruelties with sirens or explosions or dramatic confrontations. It fails politely, with forms that get misfiled, with assessments based on assumption, with quiet dismissals that compound into tragedies, with a small, daily decision to look away instead of leaning in. And that's why what happened here today matters, not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary. Because it happens every day, in every hospital, to people who don't have the power to make a phone call that changes everything. The room fell silent after she spoke. There was nothing more to say. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the quiet failures in your own life, your own work, your own community, then share it. Someone needs to hear this today. And ask yourself, what would you have done? Not if you knew who she was, but if you didn't. If she was just another patient, another person, another human being asking for help. Would you have been Dr. Crane, dismissing what didn't seem important? Would you have been the silent nurse, seeing but not speaking? Or would you have been Deidre, afraid but present, small but significant, doing the right thing even when no one was watching? The answer to that question matters more than you might think. Because tomorrow, in hospitals across the country, that question will be asked again, and again, and again. And someone's life might depend on the answer.